In literature, there's something called the everyman. Now, the everyman refers to a character who's just an ordinary individual. They're someone that the audience or the reader is supposed to be able to relate to. And they're often placed in these extraordinary circumstances. And if you pay close attention, you'll find everyman characters in just about every kind of storytelling medium, from movies, plays, books, they're all there. And several famous examples come immediately to mind. The first would be Dr. Watson from Sherlock Holmes. He represents the perfectly normal Victorian-era Londoner with a respectable job who then gets paired with this brilliant but extremely eccentric Sherlock Holmes. So Watson is the everyman character who transports us into the story. Alice from Alice in Wonderland is another such character. It's through the lens of this very ordinary girl that we get sucked into all the craziness down the rabbit hole. So the everyman character type is about as old as literature itself, and we still find it yet today. Now, thinking of the everyman, in today's lectionary reading, we come to the book of Job in the Old Testament. It opens rather ambiguously when we compare it with all the other ones. It simply says, there was once a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. It's strange. We don't know if the land of Uz ever even existed. We have no idea when or where this story really took place, or if it really even happened at all. It's essentially like the author is saying, once upon a time. Now, why is this? Well, as I'm going to show in this sermon, Job is an example of the everyman. We are all Job, and Job is all of us. Now, to begin to understand what I mean by all that, we have to look seriously at this story. Some of you already know it, but others maybe not. Once upon a time, there was a man named Job. He was one of the richest men who had ever lived, but he didn't let that success go to his head. And he was also one of the wisest and kindest men who ever lived. He was a very good man. He loved God. He walked with God, and he avoided evil. And when he did sin, he immediately repented. And he had an amazing family, a loving wife, 7 sons, and 3 daughters. And he also had a massive farm. Now, you might be thinking, how can I relate to that? It sounds pretty grandiose. Well, that's the author's point. Job is supposed to kind of represent the best of humanity. He's like our paragon. And his possessions, well, to us, it should sound kind of like the ideal of the American dream. If you work hard, you can achieve anything. If we work hard and we're good people and we obey God, good things will come to us. But more on that in a bit. Continuing along with the story, we're transported to this really bizarre scene in heaven. Our text says that Satan comes before God. Now, this might sound perplexing to some of you. How is it that Satan can come before God? Well, this might very well be an error in translation, to put it very bluntly. See, in the original Hebrew text, it doesn't use the name Satan at all. Instead, it says the accuser. Now, this is a subtle but very, very important distinction. Later translators felt that this accuser had to be referring to Satan, and that was quite possibly a mistake. We don't know for sure, but it could have been. But most Hebrew scholars Instead, they recognize that this is symbolically referring to some member of the heavenly host who acts sort of like a prosecuting attorney. He finds the fault and the sins of other people. So God brags about Job's character to this accuser, this prosecuting attorney. And he fires back and says, look, this guy is only good because you protect him. If you take that away, he'll curse you. So God accepts this as a challenge, and he says, fine, do your worst. We'll see what happens. So the next day, everything falls apart. Has that ever happened to any of you? You know, things are going great, and then just suddenly everything just comes crashing down around you. So it is with Job, our everyman. You know, his enemies just suddenly attack and they slaughter everything in sight. All his riches are gone in an instant. And then a storm comes and all his children are brutally killed. And Job collapses in despair and he says, I came into the world with nothing and I will leave this world with nothing. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Praise be the name of the Lord. And the Bible explicitly says that Job didn't blame God for any of these disasters. It's incredible. I mean, his faith endures in spite of everything. So this nasty accuser comes back to God and basically says, look, you didn't let me go far enough. I couldn't harm him directly. So if you take his health away, then he'll turn his back on you. So once again, God says, fine, do your worst, but his faith will endure. And then the next day, Job horrifically finds himself afflicted with this strange disease. He's covered from head to foot in these agonizing boils and sores. And Job goes out to the ash heap, to the garbage dump, and he breaks off a piece of pottery, and he's just sitting there and scraping at his sores. And his wife comes and says, Job, just curse God and die. Be done with it. But once again, Job's faith perseveres. He says, no, the Lord brings good things and bad things in our lives. Praise the name of God. I will not curse God. And once again, the text notes that Job doesn't curse God, doesn't blame God. And my friends, this is the story as we have it. Now, I bet a lot of you cringe. I mean, this is some pretty nasty business. The images of suffering are visceral. These scenes in the heavenly court are frightening and even disturbing. You know, one might even question God's character. You know, why would he allow someone he loves to be tortured so callously? You know, is it all just a game to God? And what is this relationship between sin and suffering? You know, why do good people suffer and why do bad people seemingly prosper? You know, this book, it just haunts us with these questions, and it haunts us because Job is our everyman, and we see ourselves in the character of Job. And my friends, may I submit to you this morning that this is exactly what the original author intended. You see, most scholars today believe that this story was actually written during the heart of Israel's exile in Babylon. And that knowledge is a game changer in the way that we interpret the overall meaning of this story. See, in the 6th century, the Jewish people were forcibly removed from their homeland. The temple was gone. The sacrificial system of making offerings to God was gone. The city of Jerusalem itself had been reduced to smoldering ashes. And for 2 generations, God's people were in chains. As those who'd experienced the days of exile grew old and died out, newer generations of God's people were born into captivity. They were born into chains. So naturally, the theological questions came. If God is who he says he is, why did he let this tragedy happen? Did we bring these curses on ourselves and our disobedience to God? And then the young people, well, they must have thought, but wait a minute. We didn't do anything wrong. Why are we being punished for the sins of our forefathers? Or could it be that Babylon's gods are mightier than our God? In other words, everything from the old world was gone. And thus, everything they knew about God, it had to be re-examined and reinterpreted in the light of their present suffering and exile. And this is what the book of Job does. It asks the difficult questions, and it doesn't provide any easy answers. Job is the everyman of Israel, Israel brought to the ash heap. And if you need any more proof of what I'm saying here, in the original Hebrew, Job's name, Eob, it literally means, where is the divine Father? Job is the allegory, the everyman that drives this overarching question of the book. Where is the divine Father? And I think it's safe to say here on this first Sunday in October that Job is our everyman too. We are all Job. Job is all of us. You see, there are or will be moments in all of our lives when we too will be driven to the proverbial ash heap, asking these same haunting questions. And so what the writer of this fable does is show us where the divine Father isn't. The divine Father isn't in their bad theological system of the past, and that also rears its ugly head in our present day. You see, the basic understanding of God in ancient Israel was, if they do good, they'll be blessed. But if they're bad, they'll be cursed. It's quite literally a religious system that was built around blessings and curses. And we see this theology all throughout Job. When Job's friends, they come to visit him, and they all think that he must have sinned somewhere along the line. He had to have done something to deserve all of this. And if we're being perfectly honest with ourselves, I bet we do the same thing too. The reality is that this theology of blessings and curses, it's just as ingrained in our culture today. In today's form, we just simply call it the prosperity gospel. The famous televangelist Oral Roberts, he once said that he drove the finest cars and lived in a mansion because God designed life for believers to be an abundant life. God designed you to live in the overflow. This is a deadly theology, and it dupes a lot of people. But it's perfect. It's perfect for our consumerist culture. It reduces God and faith down to a commodity. And we end up thinking that our supposed faith and our good deeds will bring us these absolutely perfect lives. But the writer of Job uses the everyman of Job to say that this thinking is all wrong. We should never try to serve God because of what we think that we can get out of him. God isn't a God of blessings and curses. And instead, the writer of Job paints a much more sobering and realistic picture of reality. Just as Jesus says, thieves can come in and break in and steal everything that we possess. Everything that we have in this world, from our health to our houses and to our relationships, all of it is vulnerable. All of it is impermanent. Job lost everything in one day. Jerusalem was obliterated and her people were marched off in chains in one day. So where is the divine Father? It can't be in these things. A faith that endures, a faith that accepts the good as well as the bad. It's the only thing that can endure. Job must be our everyman of faith, and we echo along with him, shall we receive good from God, and shall we not also receive evil? Now, if you know the story, then you know what happens at the end. The everyman Job, he demands to know why he's suffered. So God finally speaks to him out of the whirlwind, but it's not what he expects. God just basically says, I'm God, I know what I'm doing, and you don't. So in essence, he tells Job, and through Job, the Israelites, and even all of us, that God is the one in charge. Yes, these things happen. Yes, they don't make sense. They don't seem right to us. But the reality is we're just incapable of understanding God's purposes and the fullness of the universe. So we just have to trust that. We have to trust that God is in control. Now, this is how the book ends. Maybe that explanation satisfies some of us, but maybe it doesn't. But we have to go back to that earlier point. The Israelites were trying to make sense of God in exile by asking that question, where is the divine Father? And while this provides something, of an explanation, their understanding, it has to be stated, their understanding was incomplete. By contrast, when we try to make sense of God in exile, when we've been driven to the ash heap, we go to the Lord Jesus Christ. In him, our understanding is complete. So let me explain. This may actually shock some of you. But this God that the writer is talking about in chapters 1 and 2 of the book of Job isn't the real God. You heard me right. See, just as Job is the everyman who represents all of the Israelites and by extension all of us, this God in chapter 2 and chapter 1 is also what we call a straw man. He's saying that our whole system of blessings and curses, this is what we have reduced our belief in God down to. He's this capricious kind of braggart who only cares about our holiness and our purity and who rolls the dice with his heavenly courts, just testing us to see if we measure up. And then what happens as a result is this straw man God is a God who is impervious to our pain and to our suffering. He asks the question, where is the divine Father? And he says, this isn't it. What we've done is created this jaded caricature of God. And so we ask, if he's not there, then where is the divine Father? The divine Father becomes our Abba Father through Jesus Christ. See, if there was a heavenly court, that accuser has been replaced by an advocate. Jesus looks at his servant Job, the everyman, and says, I love Job so much that I will suffer in his place. I will become what he is, and I will suffer with him and for him. So in other words, Jesus is the true everyman. Jesus becomes Job. Jesus becomes what we are. This allegory becomes reality in Jesus Christ. We don't serve a God that is removed or detached from our suffering. We don't serve a God who places bets as to whether we can persevere or not. No, we serve a God who comes down from heaven, becomes one of us, and marches right into his own place of ashes. And just as we do, when we suffer our trials, Jesus himself cries out in the Garden of Gethsemane, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. My sisters and brothers, we serve a God who knows our pain and who has been literally where we are. Job is the everyman. Job is all of us. At some point in our lives, we'll all be asking that same agonizing question, where is the divine Father? But unlike the days of old, it isn't a question that has no answer. No, we'll see that Jesus is our true friend. He isn't judging us. He isn't looking at what we did or didn't do like Job's supposed friends. No. He's sitting right next to us, holding our hand and weeping tears of blood because he loves us that much. He says to us in our broken, our most low moments, as we sit there in the ash heap, picking away at our own wounds, he says, I will never leave you, nor forsake you. And then there's one last thing. There's a bit of a weird irony that closes the book of Job. All throughout, the author made the case that this whole system of blessings and curses, this whole prosperity gospel is a sham and that we shouldn't look at God in this way. But then it says, the Lord restored his fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before. I mean, isn't that going against the very thing that he's been talking about the whole time? You know, some have even said that this wasn't part of the original book, that it was added much later because they didn't like how it ended so negatively. So here's the deal. I think that looks ahead to what Christ accomplishes on the cross. My sisters and brothers, there is an epilogue to each one of our ash heaps. We don't know what it'll look like, but as Job seemingly prophesies here, we know that it'll be better than whatever came before. Jesus is the true Job who was truly innocent and without sin and who suffers so that we might be justified, so that we might be restored, and so that we might have the hope of a new life in him, even if it comes out of the ashes. Thanks be to God. Amen.